All right, good afternoon. If you're tuning in, we're in Genesis and we're at chapter 38. And that there's an interlude here where we've been following Joseph, the snot-nosed rat, who tells his brothers. I mean, it's one thing to have a dream like he has, where he dreams basically through through metaphors and symbols. He dreams that his brothers and his parents too are going to bow down to him, and then he goes and tells them, and then he does it again. He has two dreams. He tells them both times. I mean, Joseph is probably young, first of all, and that's a characteristic in Joseph's defense. It's a characteristic of adolescence to be self-centered and to not think of. Obviously, Joseph doesn't think about how his brothers will take the the information he's giving them because he's kind of wrapped up in himself, which is typical of adolescence. So Joseph is young and he doesn't yet think about the impact of his words on other people, and so his brothers first they want to kill him. Their original intent is to murder him. So his brothers are no better. I mean, if we're contrasting characters, Joseph is a brat and he's self-centered and he's immature, but his brothers are worse because they're older, which means they should know better. So being immature is just being immature. But when you're grown up, then you're more responsible. So the brothers first plot to kill him, and then their brother talks him out of it, Reuben, and they end up throwing him in a pit, and then they sell him into slavery to some traders that are on the way to Egypt, and that's where we last leave him. He's sold to a man named Potiphar. So that's over. That's where we covered. Now we're going to switch back to Judah, and this is probably some time after. I mean, Judah ends up being a widower here, and so we're going to follow Judah, who's the fourth brother. Judah's the fourth brother, but he's important because he's the brother. For us, he's important because Judah is the forefather of Jesus. Jesus, sometimes called the Lion of Judah. Have you ever heard that phrase? But Judah is the tribe that Jesus descends from. So Judah is the great, great, great whatever of Jesus. And I'm going to forewarn you because this is the Bible. I've said this before, but I think people are continually surprised by it. But the Bible's not a children's book. The Bible's not rated G, and that's just the way it is. That's a fact, and that's a reality. It's at least an R-rated book, and this scene is rated R and involves adult material. And yeah, hopefully we're all mature enough to handle that. I think we are. Maybe I might not be so much, but I'm still working on my maturity more, I guess, than most of us. So here we go. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hirah. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and lay with her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So Judah has a wife. His wife bears Judah 3 sons, and he gets a wife for the oldest son first, which we know now, that's the order, right? We learned that with Jacob's story. Parents always want to marry the older sibling first, and that's what happens here. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. The text, we would want to know more, maybe, like why was he wicked or what happened, what did he do? We don't know. The text doesn't think it's important to tell us. But whatever he's done, God doesn't like it. So God kills him. God smites him. Then Judah said to Onan, so, okay, and maybe I should do this now. Some of you, how many of you came to the class on sex and gender in the Bible? None of you. Oh, wow, okay. Well, then this will all be news to all of you. So um, there's a custom, not just a custom, but a law in the Old Testament called levirate marriage. Have any of you ever heard that phrase before?
Yeah, no.
No one's heard.
What day is it again?
Levirate. Let me write it on the board. So I'm going to get up.
To do with the brother marrying?
It, yes. Write it down. Okay, that's what I'm saying. That helps. Now, levirate marriage was a Jewish law and custom, and what it said was that if, in the case like we're having here, this is a case study of levirate marriage. If a brother man who has siblings gets a wife, and then that man dies, then that man's brother has the obligation to marry his dead brother's wife. But that's not all. The other, and this is actually the important piece for the story. The children who issue from that levirate marriage do not belong to the living brother. Those children belong to the dead brother. So they will inherit what was the older brother's. Okay, does that make sense? And this, this served two purposes really. One, it allowed the dead brother to have a heritage, to have a progeny and a future, and we know how important that is in the Bible. The whole promise to Abraham is about having children, having descendants, right? One of the worst things for this culture, this is not a judgment or I'm not making a proclamation of what you should believe or what's right, but in this culture, one of the worst things in the world would be to not have children, to be left without descendants, without a future. Imagine, I've said before, there's no afterlife, right? There's no dying and going to heaven and living forever with the angels and the clouds. So your hope, imagine if all of your hopes for the afterlife were projected then onto your children. I mean, the afterlife they believe in was the life that comes after them for their children. So it was very, very important to leave behind children. So that's the first purpose of levirate marriage, is to make sure that your brother does not die without issue, doesn't die without a future, without an afterlife. And think of it that way. I mean, as a brother, it'd be your responsibility to ensure that your sibling has an afterlife. Think of it that way. Like if it was up to you, Jim, to make sure that your brother could go to heaven. That's the weight of this responsibility.
So then, though, So George is the oldest and Bill is the second. So George then has progeny or offspring.
Yeah.
What about Bill?
Well, he can have his own wives. I mean, remember, this is polygamy is. Yeah, sure.
That simplifies everything.
It does. It does. Well, I don't know. I don't think it simplifies anything. But it solves that particular problem, but it probably causes more problems than it solves to have more than one wife, I would imagine. But anyway, yeah, polygamy, that's a good question, though, because, we would think that we don't do that. But, yeah, polygamy. So, yeah, the second son can have his own wives and his own children, but being the second son, his inheritance isn't going to be the same, right? The firstborn gets birthright, gets the property, gets the lion's share of the inheritance. So there is that issue of jealousy and that feeling of, well, I'm going to provide my older brother an heir, which means that my children will not get the firstborn's inheritance, right? And that's the dynamic at play in this. Oh, sorry, I got to say this. The second reason for levirate marriage is because remember that women in this society, women in this culture, did not have rights, did not have property rights, did not have, did not have a they were non-personas. I don't know, that's a legal definition. It means you have standing in a court of law, and women did not have standing in a court of law. So if a woman was very vulnerable. She could not accuse someone of robbery or of extortion or cheating or lying in a deal. She would need a man to represent her in court. And so a woman, a widow, we know this from the Bible, right? The Bible's always telling us to take care of widows. Well, why? Well, because widows are vulnerable. A woman needs a man in this. Not, and again, not making a pronouncement of what you should believe or what's right. Just describing a woman needed a man, basically, to survive. So levirate marriage provided the brother with offspring, which was the hope for the afterlife in this culture, and two, provided the woman with a place to live, with a guardian, with someone to take care of her in a culture where you needed a man to get by as a woman. All right.
But could I ask,
Sure.
I don't understand how God slowed him and killed him. Is this just a way of saying that something happened to her, and he seemed to have some wickedness in him, so it was attributed to God, or what does that really mean?
That's a good question, but no, I don't know. I mean, what happened? Did a lightning bolt come from the sky? No, probably not. And all we can do is guess. The text doesn't say that, which means the text doesn't think it's very important. That's not the point of the story. We don't know why why the elder brother was wicked. We will know, though, why the other brothers, because I'm going to, spoiler alert, the others are going to get smote too. Smitten, smote, I don't know. The other two brothers, the next brother's going to die also, but we know why he'll die. But we don't know why this brother dies, why God doesn't like him. Yes, a lot of that, surprisingly enough, a lot of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, especially Genesis, isn't as moralistic as we expect it to be. I mean, all sorts of things happen. Right? Even if you've followed the story so far, remember the rape of Dinah and the brothers asking for everybody in the village where the rapist lived to be circumcised, and then they come and they slaughter the whole village. Trying to think but yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's gone on around here in the last 37 chapters that seems immoral, and God says nothing. I mean, and the text says nothing. It doesn't say, well, this is why, and God didn't like that. And no, it just, there's a lot of these are just stories, and there's no moral commentary. The Bible doesn't give any moral commentary, which is, I think that surprises a lot of folks that kind of expect the Bible as an entirely pious book, and it's always concerned about what's right and what's wrong. But in a lot of these stories, the text doesn't really care so much about right and wrong. Although in this passage, this section, the text does seem to care about what's right and wrong, but it wasn't whatever did. That's not. So let's just keep reading. I wish I could give you a better answer, Linda. That was a good question.
Well, that's fine. I just see that happens a lot in reading, that God does this and does that, things that would require him to have arms and legs. So I don't know what that means. I just wonder in general, does that mean that God is that people didn't understand why this happened, and so they attributed it to God? I just wondered if that was a theme that appears, and that's how we understand it, or just that it wasn't important. It happened. We don't know why it happened. God did it.
Yeah, I think in this case it's not important. I mean, I don't know that this requires God to have arms and legs. I mean, he could have had a heart attack. He could have had an aneurysm. Um, and we don't. I mean, it just doesn't tell us how he died. God might not have stabbed him. Probably didn't appear in the night and stab him or something. He probably died of something. I mean, likely that he died of something we would consider a natural cause. But the point is that the Bible says that, and again, it's not as important with but it will be important with the other brother, that God wanted him dead. And that'll be an important theme for the rest. If that's not true, then none of the rest of this story will make any sense. Right? Okay. So now Is dead. Verse 8. Then Judah said to Onan, lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother. So that's a summary of levirate marriage. I gave a more in-depth explanation, but that includes everything just in a nutshell right there, right? Produce offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death also. So, right, he used, and again, this is not a children's book. He uses the pull-out method. This is what teenagers do, somewhat foolishly, and it doesn't produce an heir, doesn't produce an offspring. And this is wicked. And how many of you have heard the term onanism before? Onanism is a term that was used in the 19th century for masturbation. And this text was used throughout the Victorian period, at least in the Western world, to condemn masturbation. But if you really read it in context, you can see it's not about masturbation at all, right? And it doesn't even really have to do with the sexual act itself. It's not that he spills his seed on the ground per se that angers God. It's that he does not fulfill his obligation to his brother. Which is interesting too, because that's the brother that God killed. God didn't like him. God disliked him, let's put it this way, because God doesn't dislike people. God loves everybody. But God was angry with him enough to kill him, but still takes an interest in doing right by him, right? Which is worth noting. God, this brother, even though God struck him down, God still cares that he has offspring and that his brother fulfills his duty to him. And that really, so Onan's sin is not a sexual sin. Onanism, yeah, you can look that up and read about the history of that, but it really doesn't have anything to do with the sexual act itself. It has to do with responsibilities towards brothers, which again has been the theme of half of Genesis, right? From Cain and Abel to Isaac and Ishmael to Jacob and Esau to Joseph and his brothers. The Genesis is very concerned about brothers' relationships to brothers, obligations between them, love between them, forgiveness between them. And so this just continues a theme that we've seen strongly throughout the book. All right, now Onan's dead too. So, verse 11, Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. Which is, that in itself is normal. Again, if her father is still alive and she needs a man to protect her, that man can be your father, right? You can go back to the house of your father as long as your father's living. So that's what Judah suggests for her to do. And he uses as the excuse, and we know it's an excuse because of what comes next, that his third son is too young to get married. But really, that's not his reason. Because he thought, this is the end of verse 11, he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. So this somewhat speaks to Linda's question about what was going on here. Did they just say God did it to explain what they didn't understand? Here we can tell, actually it seems that Judah doesn't know why his sons have died. Judah's not aware. The narrator, who's always omniscient, right? the narrator knows that God has done this, and the narrator is telling us, but it doesn't appear that Judah knows. Judah, how do I put this? Judah just thinks this woman's bad luck. Right? I've sent this woman two of my sons. They both end up dead. Something's fishy about this woman. I'm not sending my third son to this woman who's bad news. And that's not. I mean, yeah, that's human and right. It's not reasonable, I guess, but it's understandable. Yeah, if I married two of my sons off to the same woman and those two sons both mysteriously ended up dead, I don't know. I might not want to send my third son to marry that woman. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. All right. Verse 12. After a long time, the text tells us. Oh, I'll say one other thing. There's one person who is even, in some senses, greater or more authoritative than God, which is the narrator. Because the narrator is the person telling us what God is doing. So we just have to rely. We're at the narrator's mercy. We can only know what the narrator tells us, and we're as far as what God is doing. In some senses, we have to live with what we're given. And if we want more, as often we do, why did God do this? How did God do it? We're left to our own devices. All right. Well, so after a long time, and that's key, it's been a long time. That means the son, whatever the excuse that Judah's given, that his son is too young, is not a valid excuse anymore. The daughter of Shua died, so now Judah is a widower. He's lonely. He's a lonely man. His wife is gone. When Judah had recovered from his grief, so this is after the period of Shiva, he's mourned, and after that's over, he goes up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira the Adulamite went with him. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Eniam, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. So through the grapevine, Tamar knows that Judah's wife has died, she knows that he's on his way to this place, and she knows that this son is all grown up, and she hasn't received a letter in the mail saying, "Come get married." So she knows that she's been, I don't know how to put it. Yeah, she's been scorned. She's been abandoned. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." Now that's funny. Sorry, I guess it's not funny. It is funny though, because the moral is what? The moralism, the reason why it's funny to me is the moralism here is not that the text isn't, I don't detect any judgment that he's patronizing a prostitute. There is judgment that he would be committing a form of incest, and the text does care about that enough to tell us, but he didn't know, right? So that is what it is. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" So he doesn't have payment now, so a pledge is something that she can, like a promissory note, something with his signature on it, something that she can use as leverage later if he doesn't do what he said, if he doesn't pay her what he's promised. He said, "What pledge should I give you?" "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enium?" Now, he assumes that she's a shrine prostitute. I've said this, meaning that, but I think I've mentioned this in several sermons, but it was very common practice in the ancient world that priestesses would be prostitutes, and your visiting the prostitute would be your act of worship. That you'd go see the priestess, and you would make your offering to the goddess through the priestess. Okay, to use a euphemism, and it's we smile and we kind of roll our eyes, but that was sincere. That was normal, and no one would have thought. And again, notice the text doesn't. There's no like judgment given here in the text, because in this culture that was normal, and that was a legitimate form of worship. And it was very common, and it was very common all the way up through the time of Jesus and the pagan religions of Greece and Rome. This type temple prostitution or religious prostitution was very normal. And it even had a kind of social legitimacy, right? I mean, he tells his friend, we would not tell our friend, right? Send this goat to the prostitute I slept with as payment. You would want to keep that a secret in our culture, but Judah doesn't have. He's not ashamed of this. He says, "Send the goat." Yeah, he tells his friend, we would do it ourselves in the dark of night. But he just tells his friend, "Go do this for me." So it tells you that this was, it had a sort of social acceptance. Okay, follow the story again. Now he says, "Where's the shrine?" He asked his friend, the Adullamite. The friend takes the goat, and he says, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enium?" And they answer, "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. "There is no shrine prostitute that sets up on this corner of the street." Then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." So he doesn't want everyone to know, right? He doesn't want this to come in front of the whole community.
Not for what he did, but for the fact that he made a bad bargain. He gave her too much stuff.
Well, that he couldn't pay back his debt, or that he couldn't pay what he owed, or that, I don't know. It doesn't say exactly what his sense of shame here is about. But it could be. It could also be. I don't want to say that Judaism does not accept prostitution. Canaanite culture did, pagan culture did, but Jewish culture did not approve of this at all. And so what I would say, my suspicion is, Judah is a lonely man, and he doesn't want the community to know that his loneliness got the better of him, and he turned for companionship and comfort and pleasure to this prostitute. He doesn't want to admit his frailty, his loneliness, and that he succumbed to his loneliness. All right. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." Right? So Judah doesn't know that he's the father. He doesn't know. She apparently remained in disguise the whole time. And so, he's judging her a lot more harshly than he judged himself, which is also human, right? It was okay for him. Well, he's a little bit ashamed about it. He knows he probably shouldn't have done it. But when he hears that his daughter-in-law has committed prostitution, he wants her killed. So he's a little more merciful to himself than he is to others, that's how we all are, isn't it? We always judge other people's sins more harshly than our own. Because why? Why do we do that?
Easier. Blame
Do
somebody
we
else.
think we're perfect?
No, we don't really think we're perfect, but we
Easier.
excuse ourselves.
Yeah,
Yeah, we excuse. How do we excuse ourselves?
blaming somebody else.
Well, we might blame someone else. But I'm thinking, go ahead, Carla.
Well, it just will think of something, some reason why we had to do this thing.
Right.
That
We know our reasons.
yeah, we know why we did that. But someone else.
Yeah, I mean, Judah was, again, we know his wife has died. He's probably still incredibly lonely and sad. So he's done this out of his weakness, and he knows how intense his loneliness was. He knows how in need he felt. He knows what it felt like to be him when he turned to this. And so we know our own mitigating circumstances. We, like you said, you hit it right on the head, Carla. We know everybody's sin. Everybody commits sins, does so because they're under pressures that they feel more intensely than we do, right? And so we know the pressures we felt, we know the emotions, we know the weaknesses of ourselves, but we don't feel those or know those for other people. So we judge other people's sins more harshly than we judge our own. Because we know our own, there were circumstances, right? Why I did this. And that's the same thing for Judah. He knows, but and so he judges Tamar more harshly than he judges himself. Any other comments on that? Okay. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant. Now this is awesome. This is clever. I am pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. And she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. This is great. You just have to cheer for Tamar here. When the time came for her to give birth, I'm skipping. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah, and he did not sleep with her again. So here, we're seeing, I love Genesis so much, because we see all the sides of people. We see characters who are complex, and the morality that we're looking at here is not black and white, and it's not simple. We see Judah in the same chapter at his worst, and we see him at his best, right? We see him judging Tamar more harshly than he judges himself, and then we see him have the character and the humility to admit, I was wrong. And not only does he admit that he's not just admitting that he was wrong to have slept with her, not just admitting that he was wrong and hypocritical to ask for her death, he's also admitting that he was wrong in not giving his third son to her. So there's sort of a full humility and repentance here. It takes Tamar's shame, Tamar's act of shaming him, but the way he responds to that act of shaming from Tamar is very noble and shows character. And the Bible's asking us, I think, to see that and admire it. All right. Verse 27, when the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out. And she said, so this is how you have broken out. And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was given the name Zerah. What does this remind you of? Jacob and Esau. What Jacob's name means, heel clutcher. And the image is that as they were born, Esau came out first, but Jacob was holding on to his heel, trying to get out first. So this theme of brothers striving against each other, brothers, relationships of brothers to brothers, and all of the complexities is the theme of Genesis. That's why Genesis is about everything. Genesis is so important for us to study because we're all brothers and sisters. We're all siblings, and its theme is our relationship to our brothers. And whether you're a man or a woman, that's, especially in Christianity, but in Judaism too, the recognition that our fellow human being is our brother. And so that it's just, this whole book is all about the morals of our relationships to our brothers, which is everybody. And this theme of striving, competition between us, that's life, isn't it? Don't we compete with our brothers and sisters over everything? Who's getting more? That's not fair. That it starts when you're a child, but it doesn't. I don't think it ends. I see it all the time in churches. Yeah, rivalry, jealousy, competition. Who's going to get their way? Who's going to be recognized? Who gets credit? Who gets honor? Who's the favorite? That's right. So, yeah. Anyway, that's the end of the interlude. I really love this passage because the moral teachings and the humility. It's not simple, right? It's not like and it's, again, Bible's not a children's book. It's fine to teach children. Here's the rules, just follow them. But real morality is complicated, and this chapter shows us a complicated morality. There's not just good guys and bad guys, and the characters themselves every character here is a mix of good and bad. Except Tamar is probably the best. And Judah's right. Judah says, Tamar is more righteous than I am. Even though she tricked him. Right? So again, but there's still complexity, right? Tamar did deceive and did commit prostitution. But Judah says she's more righteous. But that statement itself shows character, moral character. It shows humility on Judah's part. You see how beautiful and morally complex these stories are? It's great. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Well, I think, okay, we'll do, we can finish Genesis 39. We'll do one more chapter. And this is a famous story. The story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And there's some tropes here that are a little bit sexist. But that's, again, I'm not advocating for that. It's just the way it is. Women are always the temptresses and the seductress. That's what we have here. But it's, again, we're seeing the moral development of Joseph's character. Joseph has been what? What do we notice about him? That he's self-centered, right? He's wrapped up in his self. And he doesn't have the restraint. We said it's one thing to have the dreams, but it's a error in judgment and a lack of restraint to tell his brothers you have the dreams, right? Yeah. So he lacks restraint. It's that in our own relationships, and I don't know, in mine anyway. It's what you don't say that matters often, isn't it? In an argument with your spouse, on the internet, I often make that mistake. But we make the error of, more often than not, we should not say, right? But we let things come out that we shouldn't. And really, that's about restraint. It's about self-discipline and saying, I could say this, but I'm not going to. I might even want to say it because it would make me right, and it would be, I would really, if I said this, I'd really show them. There was a comic book in the comic in the New Yorker. I don't know if you guys follow those, but they're famous for their little one-frame comics, and it's this dad, a dad in a tie and a sweater, and he's leaning down, he's talking to his son, this little boy, and he says, son, if you don't have anything nice to say, say something clever but devastating. And but that isn't that the culture we're living in right now, where I don't know I spend more time than I should online, but on Twitter and Facebook, it's kind of a game of who can say the clever but harsh and biting, who can get that best line in. But to not say that thing that's clever but devastating, or to not have to be right, or to want to say to your older brothers who probably pick on you, to not say, see, someday I'm going to be over you. That's the restraint that Joseph lacks. Chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Now, this is what we mean by the Lord's favor. This is another image of grace, that God likes Joseph. Sort of in the mirror image that God didn't like We don't know why, but God likes Joseph. God's favor is upon Joseph. And so when we talk about grace, or when we read in the Gospels, the angels that say the good news to those on whom his favor rests, think about Joseph, that Joseph enjoys God's favor. God's on his side. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph's the golden boy, right? Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. So you can't keep Joseph down. You can sell him into slavery, but wherever you put him, he's going to rise to the top. And there's people that are like that just seem to live a charmed life.
Don't you just hate him?
Yeah, you do. you want to kill them and throw them in a pit.
They're usually nice.
Right.
And that does make it worse because you can't hate them. But that's Joseph. And we know he's good looking too. This story is gonna. He's good looking. He's smart. His dad loves him the best. He gets the coat. He's smart. Yeah, you just want to hate him, but you can't. Everybody loves him. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. So that's how big God's favor is, that even the house he lives in kind of benefits by proximity. Whoever is not only does God bless everything he does, but God blesses just everything around him. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. God even blesses Potiphar's crops because Joseph's there. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was, I don't know what your text says, well-built and handsome. Is that what yours says? I've got the NIV here. So Joseph's good-looking on top of it. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." So now is the temptation. Joseph, who did not have restraint, who could not keep his mouth shut about his dreams, and had to tell his brothers that he was going to rule over them. Let's see if he's grown. Let's see if he's learned restraint. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. So we're seeing the growth of his character. He now has restraint. He now can tell himself, this thing I want to do, I'm not going to do. One day, he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Do you see, though, the parallelism now? with the cloak left in the hand of the woman, and in the one case the woman is honest and is right in the right, and in this case the woman, same situation, but the woman is in the wrong. So the same situation but in two different contexts, and we see the contrast here. um, So then, verse 16, she kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story: that Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And that tells us, that's interesting, because a foreign slave would often could be put to death. There's nothing stopping Potiphar from killing the slave. Your slave was your property, and if you're, especially a foreign slave, not an Egyptian, I mean, it would have been expected for Potiphar just to kill him. So Potiphar is angry, but I think something in Potiphar knows that Joseph might be innocent, and so instead he puts him in. This is white collar prison, right? In the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So not only does he not kill him, but he doesn't. He puts him kind of in a place where he has opportunities and he's going to be treated a little bit better. While Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison ward. So there's this pattern, right? Wherever you throw Joseph, wherever you throw him, and he's going to rise to the top. Just as he rose to the top of Potiphar's house, he's starting to rise to the top in prison. Found favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. Have you seen the movie The Shawshank Redemption? That's what this reminds me of. If you haven't seen that movie, go watch it. I can recommend that movie without reservation. The warden paid no. It's got Morgan Freeman and Tim Robbins, I think, is the main character. It's a good movie. It's a movie about redemption. In that sense, it's a deeply spiritual and Christian movie, I would say. Anyway, that's what happened. The character in that movie gets thrown into prison, and he's innocent, and he becomes respected and even taken into the warden's good graces. And I won't give anything else away if you haven't seen it. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. I'm going to stop there. We'll finish Joseph's story next week. Joseph, though, now is risen to the top of the prison. Some of you know this story from Sunday school. You know what's coming, but we'll cover it next week. Let me close us with a quick prayer. Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the depth and complexity and nuance of your word and the way it challenges us to think about virtue and morality and humility, not in childish, simplistic ways, but in very deep, complex ways, that all of us are mixtures of good and bad motives. All of us struggle to be good people, to be humble. We all struggle in our relationships with our brothers and sisters. So teach us by your word to be better human beings, to be better brothers and sisters to the people around us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.